Hey, Jesse.
Hey, Katie.
How's it going?
It's fine. I do have some bread cooling that I want to eat pretty soon. So can we get right into the episode? I'm kind of in a hurry at the moment.
I mean, it's probably going to take us like an hour to record the episode. I don't think we should really rush it just so you can get to your carb loading.
Katie, I thought you might respond that way. Let me explain something to you. Those of us who bake bread frequently, and as I may have mentioned to you, I do bake bread quite frequently, including just now. When we do that, the act of baking bread brings with it a certain connection to Mother Gaia and to our ancestors that, frankly, non-bread bakers like you often fail to understand. So the fact that you just lashed out at me as viciously as you did, it doesn't surprise me. It disappoints me, but it doesn't surprise me.
Were your ancestors bread bakers?
Not that I know of. I meant ancestors in a more general sense. So
okay,
yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, well, I apologize for offending your ancestors. I hope they don't come and haunt you in the night. But we got a podcast to do, dude. So I think your bread's gonna have to wait.
Okay, I don't want to say apology accepted because that would be lying, but apology considered, if not accepted. But I'm happy to move on, and we'll revisit this later.
Okay, let's talk about this in our couples therapy.
Sounds good. Do you happen to recall the name of the podcast we are currently recording?
Oh, what is it? Blocked
Party?
This is Blocked and Reported, and I'm Katie Herzog.
I'm Jesse Single, and this is the only podcast that has ever discussed the internet.
It's great. The idea just seems so obvious, and yet it took us.
You know what? To the victor go the spoils. What are we talking about today?
We are talking about whether or not people should be required to pay their friends for sex. And also we are going to be talking about the discourse around the personal essay. And we also have a special guest today.
An extremely special guest. So you guys should stick around to that. Before we jump in, there were a couple little things from the last episode I just wanted to address. One is that we had some helpful people online point out that we might have gotten the vital Karen-Becky distinction incorrect, right?
Yes, I believe that is true.
In the last episode, we said Karen and Becky were similar. I believe I said they might be sisters. It turns out, if my understanding is correct, and I'm sure I will hear from people on Twitter if it isn't, Becky is American. Becky is like a sort of a upper middle class, complain to the manager type. Karen is sort of a more ignorant, working class British lady. So if you call someone a Karen versus a Becky, it has certain class connotations that were perhaps erased in our podcast discourse.
Right. So as loyal listeners will recall, last time we talked about the discourse around the K-slur, which was prompted in part by a tweet by Julie Bendel, the British feminist. Or after we recorded the show and put it up, Julie responded to us on Twitter, and she pointed out that in the UK, Karen is apparently a working class name, which I didn't know.
No, I didn't either.
Apologies to all the Karens out there. We said you were middle class, but apparently you're working class.
Yeah, I was going to say, we apologize to the Karens for conflating you with Beckys and to the Beckys for conflating you with Karens. You guys are separate, each special and distinct in your own ways.
Separate but equal.
Yep, that's exactly it. There's no troublesome legacy with that phrase.
Nope.
The other thing, arguably even more serious, was a person on Twitter who I like following, Chris Kavanaugh. He's a anthropologist. We were talking about sort of expertise and how tricky it is to understand what's right during the coronavirus situation. And Chris Kavanaugh, C_Kavanaugh, I think I pronounced his name. Know you. I'll put this in the show notes. He wrote, quote, "I find myself generally agreeing more with Jesse Single." Take that, Katie. Mm-hmm. But I found the discussion of this episode about expertise a little puzzling. Sure, experts are not perfect, and it's hard for laypersons to parse evidence about a complex topic, but the appropriate response would seem to be to acknowledge consensus views while still being critical and not outright dismissing contrarian views, but taking account of things like the quality of evidence they cite, relevant expertise, and track records with other topics. Yeah, I basically just agree with that. I'm worried that I came across as too sort of anti-expertise or like radically skeptical we could ever know anything. I think you and I both just think experts often get stuff wrong, and we should be somewhat skeptical, but like, I don't think either of us would say, as a general rule, don't trust the CDC on vaccination or don't trust the EPA or maybe a non-Trump EPA on something pertaining to pollution, right?
Totally. I mean, and part of the issue isn't just with, quote unquote experts. It's also with the media, right? So you and I both worked in this field. You're a much better science journalist than I am. You actually understand how to read academic papers, and I sort of stumble my way through them and have to look up a lot of words. And I think there's a lot of people in the media who are, sort of like me, who don't entirely understand what they're reporting on or report via press release. And so what you get is a lot of bad science reporting, which I think probably your forthcoming book probably deals with, at least in part. And so that, that's part of the problem, is that the media sort of has this trust. We pass that on. We pretend to understand things that we might not necessarily understand. We trust the experts. We quote the relevant people. But if we don't understand it, are we really doing a good job passing this information on to the public? And I saw a study that came out this week that was an example of this. Okay, so since the coronavirus outbreak started, I've been hearing almost daily reports about the impact of smoking and vaping on the virus. From the very beginning, one of the things that was postulated and sort of just assumed to be correct was that the reason that men in China were dying of the virus at higher rates than women was because men have a higher rate of smoking. Well, now there's several studies claiming that smokers are actually less likely to get the virus. And there's something possibly, I have no idea if this is real or not, but there's something about nicotine that is apparently inhibiting the virus's ability to spread in the human body. And so I'm seeing this study, and I'm also hearing literally daily reports about how smoking is a particular killer when it comes to this virus. And it's just like fucking with my mind, I mean,
yeah.
I would assume that smoking and vaping is bad for all sorts of lung disease. But it's possible that it also protects people. And I'm not saying that anybody should start smoking or continue smoking, in response to coronavirus. That would be insane. There are obviously lots and lots of documented health problems affiliated with smoking. But if I'm listening to NPR, which is my main source of news, I listen to it like 20 hours a day, and I'm hearing reports every day that smoking is a complicating factor, that it makes you more likely to die. And it turns out it's not true. I have a hard time trusting the news.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I am saying kids should smoke in particular. Younger people should smoke.
Older people should quit. Kids should smoke.
Kids should smoke. Yes. It looks super cool. You'll be more popular.
You'll probably get laid more.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I've actually never smoked a cigarette. I'm such a pure soul.
Wow, Jesse.
So cool.
I'm going to change that. The next time I see you, I'm going to force you to smoke.
Wow. Non-consensual cigarette sharing.
Look, I just don't want you to get COVID, okay? I need you for this podcast.
But I think this is a good example, right? Okay. So there's some uncertainty on this very specific scientific question. I think the reason I would say we should have general faith in experts is as long as either journalists or overeager scientists don't screw things up by immediately jumping to conclusions, I would imagine that if we wait 6 months or a year, we will have an answer to this question.
Right.
And I think, especially like in the book I'm working on, which hopefully will be out in about a year, this is often what happens. Like experts screw up, journalists screw up. Journalists do screw up by writing off press releases, but those press releases are often basically written by scientists. That was one of many things I learned from this book, Science Fictions, by a guy named Stuart Ritchie, coming out in July. I highly recommend it. It's really interesting. So it's not just journalists. Like scientists also do a shitty job, overselling their studies or do too good a job overselling their studies. So I guess my point is just like, over time, on most subjects, true experts will gradually start to orbit the truth. It just takes a while. And along the way, I think, you should be somewhat skeptical. And on a question like this, where it's like, I would imagine a inconclusive body of research versus a lot more research suggesting study is bad, that strikes me as an easy choice. But just to be safe, I'm going to start smoking 2 packs a day.
Same. I've been trying to convince my nurse wife that the only thing I can do for my health now is to start smoking. And she's, for some reason, she won't listen to the experts. I've told her too many times. Don't listen to experts. And now she's actually starting to believe me.
So I think you just said my nurse wife, but I like the idea of that being one word, my nurse wife.
Yeah, she's a part-time nurse, full-time wife, or part-time wife, full-time nurse.
My nurse wife. Okay. No more. I can't stop. The Borat thing will never stop being funny to me, which is why I'm so socially stunted. Okay. Anyway.
Which is why you will never have a wife.
I'll never have a nurse wife.
Yeah.
Should we move on to the fascinating question of why won't woke boys pay for sex?
Yeah, let's do it.
Part of our audience is probably not online in the sense of being on Twitter every day, but once in a while an article comes out that just takes over Twitter, or at least the horrible corners of Twitter Katie and I inhabit. And this week's article was in Mel Magazine, and it's an article by Ceci Kuwabara Blanchard. The headline is "Why Won't Woke Boys Pay for Sex?" Subtitle: Bernie bros, male feminists, and quote, good guy liberals all support sex work, but for some reason they aren't paying girls like me for sex. I'm going to just quickly read the intro to this, and then we'll get into it, because it's like sort of a fascinating cultural artifact. 4 months before Violet, a 25-year-old transsexual with dollish cheekbones and a primary color wardrobe, moved to Brooklyn, she toured with the idea of holding a, quote, farewell tour, unquote, in her lifelong home of Portland, Oregon. Her approach to putting a bow on her 20-plus years in a city mocked for its liberal leanings was to collide her two disparate worlds. Her friend circle of jewel-puffing, mulleted Bernie bros with her recent professional foray into sucking cock for cash. So first of all, I think the writing is very good throughout this article. Just professional foray into sucking cock for cash is a good phrase. The author, Ceci Kuwabara Blanchard, goes on to explain that Violet, this 25-year-old trans woman who's a sex worker on the side, was very disappointed that her friends did not want to have sex with her for cash. And the article goes on to say that basically this was politically problematic, that they claimed to support sex workers, but they didn't want to sleep with their sex worker friend. And Blanchard writes, quote, as two trans girls who keep leftist male hotties in their company and turn tricks as a side hustle, Violet and I have both observed that our peers can't get their politics straight. For one, these guys support decriminalizing sex work because they're feminists, but they also seem to not pay for sex because they're feminists. So in Blanchard's view, these men's reasons for not wanting to hire sex workers was they felt like that would be somehow exploitative. But the sort of woke lefty take is that sex work isn't exploitative at all, that it's like any other sort of work. So I think in addition to this article being confused for some few reasons we'll get into, what strikes me as interesting here is the fact that sex work being just like any other kind of work is this really important orthodox point among a lot of like young lefties now. But I think in practice, most people, whatever they think about it, and I think it should at the very least be decriminalized, we don't really view it as exactly like other kinds of work. In certain ways, it's more dangerous and more fraught and more a lot of things. Does that strike you as correct?
Yeah, I think that probably is correct. I mean, and so the author of this piece assumes that because her friends are theoretically in favor of sex work, they support sex workers, that they're willing to engage in the practice themselves. But I mean, that's sort of incoherent. I mean, I support the decriminalization of heroin. That doesn't mean I'm going to do heroin. Right. Not that I'm comparing like paying for sex with doing a drug that's going to kill you. So I'm not a swerve. Don't come at me, people. But it's just this, I mean, you can support something and still not want to take part in it yourself. It's very obvious. So the author, there's a couple other things. One of the authors claims supporting this idea that her friend that her friend's friend should be okay with paying for sex with their friend, which like in the first place is kind of weird because people don't always want to have sex with their friends. So one of the other things going on here, the author cites this study saying that, we think of the people who pay for sex work as sort of older men. We have this sort of stereotype in your head of the older, lonely guy who can't get laid paying for sex. And the author cites this study that claims that people, like half of men who purchase sex do so in their like 20s or 30s. And so I was curious about that. So I got in touch with some sex researchers and asked about the data. And they said that that's true. A lot of people do try out sex work in their, teens and 20s. But it tends to be, for the most part, that tends to be one time, right? So you might like go on vacation, probably to somewhere in Asia, pay for sex. And that's the one time that you do it. And then you like have like sort of a more conventional sex life. The people who tend to be regulars are in their, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, men who are, let's say, are past their sexual prime, who might be single or divorced or not getting what they want, from their relationships. So this idea that men are like that young men are constantly paying for sex just doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. She also kind of skirts over the fact that the sex worker is transsexual, and as is she. And she really skates over that fact, this sort of assumption that these people also probably support trans rights. Well, you can support trans rights and also not want to have sex with a trans person. And a lot of people would make the argument that that's transphobic, but it's also like a real. Yeah, go ahead.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm wondering if this all ties into like one thing that jumped out at me with this and with a lot of other pieces where I sort of. That thing about just because you support something doesn't mean you want to do it is a very obvious point. It's sort of a logical error in the piece. And when I read a certain genre piece, I'm just sort of like, where is the editor to jump in and say, hey, that doesn't make sense? I'm wondering if the other part of the question, which is a point people have raised before in writing about the so-called personal essay industrial complex, is like, should an editor maybe have a role here, like saying to Blanchard, it comes across as almost exploiting her a little bit. She's sort of exposing these very vulnerable parts of herself. And there's a long history in this subgenre of writing of like, society is fascinated by the sex lives of like young women in their 20s, which I think is her age bracket. And they don't get paid a lot for these pieces. And it just seems like they're revealing a lot and just putting it all out there, maybe in ways that, I don't want to be paternalistic, but there's stuff. There were times when I was 22 or 23 and editors said no, and I'm glad they said no.
Yeah, I mean, I had a fucking blog in my 20s, and the blog was just, I probably shouldn't say this because people will try to find it, but I had a blog, and the blog was literally just me writing about all of the dumb shit that I did. It is offline now. It has been scrubbed from the internet. You cannot fucking find it. Thank God. When I was younger, I remember my parents saying sort of all the time, like, don't put stuff on the internet that you're going to regret when you're older. And I didn't listen to them because, you don't listen to your parents. Well, it turns out they're fucking right. And I don't think personal essays are quite the same. Like Exo Jane, I think has probably died by now. There was this sort of moment when the personal essay was the thing, which we'll probably also talk about in the next segment. And that has sort of ended in some ways. But yeah, editors will absolutely, at that point at least, editors would absolutely like let you humiliate yourself, lay yourself bare, and then, give you $50 for it or whatever, which, may like sound great at the time, but when you're older and you look back on it, there's a lot to be embarrassed about.
Can I make a comparison and you can tell me if you think it's crazy?
Sure.
Okay. So in sex work discourse, it's sort of, the thing you're supposed to say is like, it's just like any other kind of work. And to suggest otherwise, or to suggest that it brings certain inherent power imbalances with it in a way other forms of work don't, is seen as offensive or unwoke. Similarly, abortion discourse it's just a medical procedure. It's just a medical procedure. Why would you have any moral problems with the medical procedure?
Right.
In both situations, I find myself probably like pretty far to the left of American public opinion on these issues. Like, I think abortion should be very legal. I think what's going on in the South and parts of the West with women being cut off from it is horrible. I'm very straightforwardly liberal on that. I also think it's sort of delusional to pretend that especially slightly later term abortions are just a medical procedure. Like similarly with sex work, you can recite the mantra of it's just work like any other work all you want. At the end of the day, there are a broad number of tasks I would happily hire friends to do for me. I would never pay a friend for sex. I just wouldn't do it. And it could be that I am unenlightened and that 100 years from now in society will find it bizarre. Anyone wouldn't pay others for sex. But I think there's this missing step of actually trying to convince people. You just sort of adopt this dogmatic mantra and you repeat it as though it's true, but I don't think most people who are in favor of decriminalizing sex work or in favor of legalized abortion actually think these things. I think these are sort of the vanguard positions, right?
Right. And there's a ton of debate within feminism about not whether sex work is work, but whether sex work is exploitative or not. And there are lots of feminists who are very, very anti-sex work. So it's not like it's this settled position. Like you just, sex work is work, clap emoji, and it's over. People are very conflicted about this. And I think you're right about abortion too. That Caitlin Flanagan, did you read her piece on abortion in The Atlantic a couple months ago?
I did not.
It's really good. We'll put it in the show notes. It's really worth reading because she comes at it from both perspectives. From the perspective of somebody who has seen what criminalizing abortion does to women, and somebody who also doesn't believe that a fetus is just necessarily a clump of cells. And it's about the conflicts, and people are conflicted about this. It's not that simple. And I think when you just sort of have the assumption that sex work is work, that abortion is just another medical procedure, like getting your finger stitched up after an accident or whatever, it turns off people who have sort of a more nuanced or more conflicted perspective there. It sort of is a way of shutting down the conversation.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right, where like these are the lines you're supposed to recite within your political bubble, but I just don't think the average person believes that. And well, with the sex worker discourse too, it's also so interesting. Like in Blanchard's piece, you know, she makes it sound like most Johns are young people, which would suggest this is more of an equal transaction, like that the most common relationship between a sex purchaser and a sex seller, like they're both in their 20s, they're both like attractive, blah, blah, blah. As you pointed out, like that's not what the research shows. The research more conjures an image of something we would describe as like maybe a little bit icky, like a guy in his 40s or 50s paying for sex with a 20-year-old. And I think that should not be criminalized. I really am pro decriminalization, even if I'm not fluent in all the nuances there. But most people would have a more viscerally negative reaction to that than to the world Blanchard wants and was disappointed didn't arrive, where people, you know, her friends would just sort of pay her for sex the same way I'd be like, will you paint my house for me if I had a painter friend? And it's just, I think, there's a little bit of distortion going on there maybe with the nature of what sex work actually is. Like this isn't an area where I'm expert, but it sounds like the stats are the stats. It is somewhat older men, somewhat men who have a little bit of actual power buying sex from younger women. And, you know, that doesn't mean it should be unsafe or that anyone should be arrested for it, but that's just sort of what it is.
Yeah, I've interviewed a number of sex workers over recent years, particularly in response to SESTA and FOSTA, which were laws that made sex work essentially harder to advertise on the internet. And I'm, you know, we can generalize about these things all we want, but every individual is different. And I do think that the power dynamic, like I have a sex worker friend who's probably in her 50s, and she's been doing this for a long time, and she has a bunch of regulars, and the power dynamic between her and her Johns, I am sure the power lies in her hands.
Yeah.
But she's also not the typical, or not what we would think of as the typical sex worker. She's, or maybe she is the typical sex worker. You know, maybe the typical sex worker actually is in her 50s and works from home, and isn't like a 20-year-old out on the streets. You know, there's also like real class issues here. There's a big difference between sex workers who can advertise online, something that the government has made harder to do in recent years, and have sort of their own safety and protections and have sort of hold all the cards, and then like someone who's walking the streets and really is in a vulnerable position.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm overgeneralizing here. I think I was thinking more of the kinds of situations Blanchard was describing, where it's like, for instance, a trans woman in her 20s, what her situation would likely be. Like, I think there's definitely sex workers, especially those who can advertise online. I mean, I think the reason these laws are terrible is it really does force this stuff into the streets, which is to no one's benefit and hurts sex workers the most because it makes their job much more dangerous than it needs to be. But
right, and SESTA and FOSTA were laws that were sponsored and supported by the sort of feminist leaders in government, including Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris. And I think probably every woman except for like Marianne Williamson, who ran for president, was, they were pushing these laws that sex workers were telling them will put us in danger, will make our lives harder. And still, they didn't listen.
I think there's almost no issue that tears feminism apart more than this one, with the possible exception of like trans stuff and like some of the arguments over sort of the Muslim world and the argument that there's more misogyny there, but it's just brutal.
Surrogacy is another one that's really which surprised me. I kind of wasn't even aware of this until the last couple of years, but surrogacy, like, really, feminists have very different perspectives on this.
Ooh, we should I know nothing about that, but maybe at some point we should talk about it.
Yeah.
The one last excerpt I wanted to read from this, because you'll see why. I'll just read it. This is Blanchard describing her own experiences. Dating, not as a sex worker. One recent dude, let's call him Brad, picked me up at a coffee shop, bought me a latte, and put his sophisticated active listening skills on full display. He then took me to a wine bar, assuring me the orange was to die for, and we romantically unpacked our traumas as he walked me home. He kissed me on my doorstep, demonstrated that he had no qualms with kissing a trans woman in public. Upstairs, Brad came repeatedly for hours. I didn't. At the end of it all, his takeaway was this: I'm not feeling it, and we probably shouldn't see each other again. So this is where I just felt like maybe there was a good, interesting, straightforward article lurking in this, what I thought was a mess of a piece. Like, what she's describing here is something I think a lot of women, trans or cis, have been through, which is feeling a certain dissatisfaction with the Tinder dating scene. And this is another example of where I think people want things to be one way. They want it to be the case that men and women are totally on the same page about the world of Tinder dating, which often brings casual sex with it or first night sex with it. But in fact, I think on net, I know, again, this is controversial. I just think men are cooler with that. And we're sort of, on average, everyone's different, less affected by that. So I think we're sort of going around in circles on that issues. And from a feminist perspective, because it's so hard to just say maybe women don't want casual sex as much as men, I think that causes the conversation to dead end a little bit.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we talked on one of our earlier episodes. I said something like men are on average hornier than women, and we got a little bit of pushback on Twitter. I think it was maybe in jest, but also I'm sure some people also like actually take issue with ideas that there are sort of essential differences between males and females. In terms of casual sex, I mean, I really think that men are hornier than women, and I don't have any data to back this up, but it would be easy to figure out, to look at a study asking how often men masturbate compared to women. And my sense is that it's going to be a lot higher. And so even if you take the other person out of the equation, I'm guessing that we would find that men are hornier than women, which also would sort of indicate that men are maybe more interested in casual sex, and they also don't have the sort of baggage that comes with it in terms of, you know, maybe I'm going to get attacked or whatever. I mean, and this isn't to say that women don't like casual sex. Women absolutely like casual sex. But, I mean, I'm a lesbian.
Wait, what?
Yeah. I know. Shocking. I know. Shocking. Women obviously have casual sex, but you don't have like the hookup culture, like the hookup apps that you have on like Grindr, which is not like a date. I'm sure relationships form on Grindr, but it's really a casual sex app, or cruising. You know, there's no like long history of women meeting up in parks to have sex with each other the way that there is for gay men. And, you know, maybe that's because of, you know, social pressures. Maybe that's because of gender roles, or maybe it's something a little bit more biological. I have no idea, but you just don't see the sort of like, there's no hookup app for women. People have tried to create it. I think there was an app called fucking Brenda at one point. There was one called, I'm not kidding. There was, maybe it's just a marketing issue. Who wants to join an app named Brenda? There was one called Scissor at one point. Also just like didn't take off. And like women meet each other on apps all the time for sure. But that sort of the idea that you're going to meet someone on an app and immediately go to their house, or like, you know, blow your Uber driver. I just can't see women doing it. I mean, some do, of course, some will. Some women have like that sort of sex drive and that sort of, you know, risky, that don't have an aversion to that sort of risky behavior. But I think it's just like less likely to happen when you're a woman.
Hold on, let me close down these porn tabs before no, I think, yeah, my understanding is that all the evidence points in the direction favoring the men are hornier on average thesis. That doesn't mean every man is hornier than every woman. It doesn't mean there's no complexity in the literature, but I do think the evidence we have, while not perfect, is pretty clear cut. I also think there's just like a matter of social norms and what like the script for a first date should be, because when I read what Blanchard describes here, and we actually ended up having a quick Twitter back and forth that was perfectly civil. I just explained why I disagreed with her. I think if I'm going to talk shit about someone or someone's article on Twitter, I should, and then they ask me about it, I should, you know, engage with them. I always get mad when people claim my work is bad and won't tell me what they dislike. So I tried to just tell her what I disliked. And part of it is, I think this assumption that if there's a one night stand and the woman feels unfulfilled or used or shitty afterward, that's straightforwardly because the man did something wrong. Like, call me a misogynist, but I think it's often more complicated than that. Like, even I've been in situations where it just turned out I wasn't on the same page as the other person, and there was no conversation before anything happened saying like, you know, what do you want? What are you looking for? People sometimes just go on a first date and they hook up and they don't have any conversation about what they want, because that's not a normal thing to do on a first date. And I think it might be more useful to just say like, if this is going to become a more and more common aspect of dating, and people don't want to feel hurt, they should just be more straightforward about what they want, which is easier said than done because there's all sorts of complicated, you know, social norms, and you don't want to come across as too stuck in your own head maybe. But I just think like if the choice is have a 5-minute conversation before anything happens versus feel hurt the next day, people should want to have.
Right. I mean, that's, in an ideal world, that's how it would work. But like you said, like there are complex norms. I mean, it would be, honestly, if I went on a first date for somebody and they started unpacking their unpacking their trauma as the author of this piece did on a first date, and then like talking about what they want in the future, that would be the first and only date for me.
That confused me so much that we're supposed to read that as, yeah.
That's a good date. Yeah. Like
also my traumas would take like 18 dates to even start to unpack. Where would you begin?
I have no trauma, so it would be a very short date.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I don't know. This again, I don't like blame any of this on Blanchard. I think she's a good writer. I think her editor sort of failed her here, and I think that shouldn't surprise us given the how much you need to feed the content beast and some of the incentives here, especially for someone like her, who's like, if you're a young trans woman who's a sex worker, you tick all the identity characteristics where an editor will be like, jackpot. Like, I don't want to be a dick, but I do think maybe they're just going to be like, wow, this is such an exotic experience we can present to readers in the way, like, I don't have to worry about that as just like a boring white straight guy when I submit something to an editor.
You're not just a white guy, Jesse. You're also a podcast co-host.
I have 2 identity characteristics: white, podcast,
and gamer. You have 3.
I'm a gamer. Game all day, every day. Have we milked this particular content utter to dryness?
Yes, let's move on.
Hold on, let me think if there's a more disgusting way I can present that sentiment. No. Okay, yeah, let's move on. You wanted to talk about this so Meghan Daum infected the entire American Southeast with coronavirus, I think.
Yes, actually, it worse. She infected Appalachia, the entire region of Appalachia. So it was actually a class of hate crime. So Meghan Daum is a friend of ours. She's a writer who is based in New York. She's written a ton of books. She's a personal essayist. Her latest book is called The Problem with Everything, which I recommend checking out. And she recently wrote a piece for Medium called I Left New York for Greener Pastures and a Puppy. And this was one in a rash of pieces written by people who left New York because of coronavirus. And so this caused a sort of minor conflagration on Twitter. Meghan's piece in particular, because she wrote that she basically got an Airbnb in Appalachia for a friend of hers, and she went through her decision process for why she decided to leave New York, and a big part of that is she just got a Newfoundland puppy. And as anybody who has a puppy will know, having a puppy means that you have to very frequently leave your house to take your puppy to go pee. And so this would have meant like leaving her apartment and like getting in her elevator and going downstairs and taking the puppy out and then getting back in the elevator like 40 times a day. Right. And so for her, I think just calculating the risk here, like going in and out of the building frequently, putting herself, her neighbors at risk in a city that has an overloaded hospital system, it just made sense to leave. And I do not fault her for that at all. I would have done exactly the same thing. But her essay and some others, Masha Gessen wrote one in The New Yorker, that were sort of in this genre. Why I Left New York is a long-time genre. It's sort of a trope in writing. Like when everybody moves to LA, they write their Why I Left New York piece. And so this is the new spin on it, is why I left New York during a pandemic. And people are fucking outraged about these essays. So Claire Fallon, a writer for HuffPo, for instance, wrote a piece called Please Stop Writing Why I Left New York Pandemic Essays. And it was a scathing takedown of Masha Gessen and Meghan Daum and some others who have contributed to this genre. So here's a typical passage, and this is about Meghan in particular. She writes, Daum mostly seems to experience quarantine as a sort of rural rumspringa, a pretext for rediscovering the bucolic delights of Appalachia. You should read Meghan's piece. It is in no way a rumspringa. She is not down there like doing meth and like rediscovering the delights of rural Appalachia. She's like living in a house somewhere and like taking her puppy out. She's been quarantined.
She's in like a 30 square foot or 200 square foot area the whole time.
Yeah.
She doesn't even leave.
Right.
Yeah.
She's like, she's not leaving. She's quarantined. I mean, she is obeying the dictates to like stay home or whatever. But she did leave New York, and there's no law against leaving New York. There's never been a law against leaving New York. But she did leave New York, against sort of lots of recommendations. And there has been a ton of dialogue about this, and it's such a complicated issue. I mean, In Washington State, where I live, there are all these coastal communities, particularly ones on islands, that are asking people from Seattle and Portland to stay away because they might not have any COVID cases in their area, but they're concerned about their hospitals being overloaded. And so there's all these people with second homes or tourists going to these communities, and they've asked them, like, don't come here, basically. And so, it's such a complex issue. And Meghan gets into that in her piece. But the response to her piece, it was kind of weird. Like, her piece came out in the beginning of April, and it took a couple weeks for some reason for a pylon to start around this, but a pylon did. And I think Meghan handled it really well, and it was actually sort of funny to observe in some ways. So Meghan tweets it, and then like weeks later, people discover the piece, and they get mad about it. So there was this like great exchange on Twitter between Meghan and this woman named Lee Hampton, who I Googled, and she's a writer who lives about 30 minutes from where I grew up in North Carolina. So Meghan posts her piece, and then this woman, Lee Hampton, responds to it on Twitter. Native Appalachian here. This is an exceptionally bad take. Rural hospitals and ecologies are not your cheap escape plan. Of all the exploitative, tone-deaf Karen moves in Appalachia's long history of being Karened by Karens, your puppy retreat in a pandemic is peak Karen. So this gets a fucking ton of likes. Hero Lee Hampton. And then, so she continues. She broke quarantine laws in 2 states after being exposed to the virus. Then she went shopping in a town with no hospital. Meanwhile, her puppy is having explosive diarrhea in bear habitat, and she publicly admits all this. What's absurd is that she hasn't been arrested. Okay, so Meghan has broken 0 laws, first of all. And also, the fact that you want her to be arrested for this, like, you think that the answer to leaving New York is to put people in a fucking prison? Like, do you know what's actually going to spread COVID is putting people in prisons. Like, prisons are letting people out right now. And also, like, explosive diarrhea in a bear habitat. Meghan is like, her puppy is in a yard.
Right.
Come on. The whole thing is just insane. So it's just like totally self-righteous.
It's just like catastrophizing style where instead of acknowledging there's some complexity here and making some recent case against what she did, which would be fine, it's just, she should be arrested. She broke every law. I think you and I are both familiar with this style of Twitter performance.
Right. And Lee also doesn't know where Meghan is. And she starts demanding that Meghan disclose her location. And when Meghan refuses to tell Lee where she lives, she says, okay, give it to a third party, and that party can check the COVID stats in your area, which is just so fucking unhinged.
Lee should be arrested for these tweets, right, in a just world.
And Meghan, by the way, like, she rented an Airbnb, like, the homeowners, I'm sure, are probably glad to have the money. Airbnbs are going.
She said they were eager because they had. She said in the piece.
And they knew that she was coming from New York. They knew about the puppy. Like, she didn't like obfuscate what she was doing to anybody. Okay, so Lee goes on this tear about this, and here's the best part. So another woman jumps in. Her name's Teresa Malahot, and I'm probably mispronouncing her name, so I apologize for that. So here's her response to Lee's tweet about Meghan Daum being the most Karen in the history of Karens. Came to see the discourse and just wanted to pop in and say, you're not native. Real natives live there and were removed so you could live there, which adds another necessary dynamic to your conversation of who has a right to live where. So Lee responds to this. Absolutely agree. Fair call out. Happy for my Eastern Band Cherokee neighbors to take over from here. But obviously I expect Meghan Daum will be even more disdainful towards them than she already has been. Okay. And then Therese responds, from an indigenous perspective, there is something ironic about settlers right now getting mad at richer settlers for moving into their territory. I say this with love. Consider the people who were removed so that you could live there, and then examine your self-righteousness. So she just like totally puts her in her place. And then, so like Meghan responds to Lee, and then Lee just immediately blocks Meghan.
This whole thing of like, happy to let my Eastern Band Cherokee neighbors take it from here. Like, I'm handing to the baton to my magical people. It's just such a it's so weird that white people get away with that online because it's so condescending, and it's just sort of like treating minorities as these mystical totems. It's so weird to me that's not seen as like what it is, which is a certain form of sort of almost positive racism. You know what I mean? It's like, it's just so so weird.
It's tokenizing.
Yeah.
So this was, I'm sure this was very annoying for Meghan Daum, but it was very amusing for me to watch. I made the mistake of jumping in and telling Lee Hampton that I am also a native Appalachian, small N native. Probably not a term that I should use, and I was more concerned about her making native Appalachians look like assholes than I am Meghan's puppy having shitting in a yard. And then she blocked me too.
Of course.
So. But you know what? Next time I go visit my parents, maybe I'll drop in and see how she's doing. Maybe we can talk about it over some coffee or something. Okay, so now it's time for our surprise. We have a very special guest. Lee Hampton will be joining us today. Just kidding. It's Meghan Daum. Meghan, welcome to Blocked and Reported.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you are our first guest. We decided that our first guest should be a colonizer.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm glad you felt safe enough to have me.
Okay, so first of all, how are you doing over in quarantine?
Probably like a lot of people's, I sort of vacillate between boredom and sort of just panic that I'm not getting enough done. I think like there's this weird mandate that I think a lot of us feel about like, oh, well, I should just use this time to be super productive. But for whatever reason, there's like this kind of ambient inertia that prevents really any sort of meaningful activity from getting done. I have found, for me anyway. Maybe some people are being incredibly productive.
I'm sure somebody is. It is certainly not happening at my household. I was going to write a book in this time, and I have so far managed to just get through like
in the last 3 weeks.
Yeah.
A lot of books have been written in the last 3 weeks.
Yeah, totally.
I'm sure they're very high quality as well.
Very, very high quality. Instead of actually writing a book or even writing a book proposal, it's like, well, I've watched a lot of television,
a lot of CNN. I have never, and I have to say, that's something I really regret. And I've stopped in the last 5 days or so. I probably watched more cable news in the last 3 weeks than I have in the last 20 years. And it's, I'm reminded why I stopped watching.
Right. It doesn't tend to make people more informed. I think it might make people less informed, actually. Much like Twitter. Okay, so let's talk about your piece. I'm guessing that you knew there was going to be a reaction to this piece that you wrote, and you decided to do it anyway. So talk to us about that.
So I definitely knew there was going to be a reaction. You know, the reason this whole incident really interests me on a lot of levels is that I really hesitated to write it. I vowed that I was not going to write about the fact that I had left the city. So, when I decided to leave, and I actually took a lot of things into consideration, and I don't know if that's really relevant to this discussion, but, I was thinking about whether to leave and if it was right or wrong and the right way to go about it. And I sort of said to myself, like, okay, fine, you can go, but you can't tell anybody. And you certainly can't write about it, because I was seeing that there was this shaming campaign mounting. And so I got down here, and there was about 3 weeks where I just could not get anything done. I have a new puppy. He was 12 weeks old when I brought him down. No, he was 10 weeks old at that time. And so I came down with a friend, and you were in this incredibly beautiful place, basically on a farm, a little farmhouse, a lot of acreage around. And I was chasing this puppy around, and it was like this weird sort of life. I had gotten into this sort of catatonic state where I was sort of watching the news constantly and also chasing this puppy around, trying to keep him from chewing things in this house that is not my house, and trying to keep him from, running into the woods. And, he's loose in this pasture, which is really idyllic in a lot of ways, but also, really worrisome. And so, this kind of weird zombie / panic state went on for a couple of weeks. And I kept saying to myself, wow, this is the sort of thing that I would write about under normal circumstances. Like, this is really interesting, and I'd like to take this on. And I said, well, too bad you can't. Okay. Think of something else. And, I do a twice a month column, every other week column for Medium. And I had a deadline coming up, and my editor said, well, why don't you write about being down there? And I said, no, are you kidding? That is asking for trouble. I would never do that. And I started actually working on another piece. I was going to do a piece about how the child welfare system was being affected by the quarantines. I don't think I would have gotten in as much trouble for that. And it, wasn't really going anywhere. That, I wasn't really doing anything with that another reporter wouldn't have done. And so, I kept saying, oh, too bad you can't write what you really want to write. And, I had this moment where I was staring out at the pasture, watching the puppy, as I do 90% of the time. And I thought, you know what? You are hesitating to write something because you're afraid of being shamed on Twitter. And what's really shameful is that you would not write something for that reason. Like, are you a real writer or not? Like, grow a pair. Honestly, I was almost angry at myself in that moment. And I also felt really liberated. So I was just like, okay, fine, I'm going to write it. And I'm going to write it in a way that, I'm going to try to thread the needle as best I can. And if people are mad at me, so be it. Because, honestly, how dare you call yourself a writer if you're going to have that kind of fear about things, if you're going to let Twitter decide what you take on. So I did the piece.
Yeah, I mean, I think of that all the time. And sometimes I come down on the side of like, I'm not going to let Twitter dictate what I cover, what I write. And sometimes I don't, because the cost is just not worth it, And there are lots of shit that I would love to write, but it's just like, you have to balance this sort of like, is the hate my editor is going to get worth me putting this out in the world? I wish I always came down on the sides of, fuck the haters, but it's hard to do that, especially when there are like real consequences here. So you weren't surprised by the reaction, but how was actually living through it for you? What was that like?
Yeah, the piece came out, and as often happens, nothing happened. It sat there for 4 or 5 days. People seemed to like it. I was getting a good response, and I actually sort of chided myself. I thought, God, Meghan, like, way to be paranoid. The piece is fine. Like, what kind of like, you're such a narcissist that you've thought that everyone would pile on your piece and anyone would care. Like, obviously, people have better things to do than nitpick at what may or may not be problematic about this piece that really, to me, is about staring into a field, watching a puppy while the world ends. That, to me, was what the piece was. And then, sure enough, somebody got a hold of it, and it kind of a match was lit. But what I now realize, I made a couple of mistakes. Actually, I made one big mistake with the piece, and that was framing it in terms of I went to Appalachia. And I did not, I was not sort of grasping the full context of Appalachia, which is that there's a lot of baggage around that particular name, and that it connotes extreme poverty, sort of catastrophic social decay. There's a history of people coming from the outside and exploiting resources and people there. And in my mind, I was just using that term because I didn't want to be specific about where I was. I wasn't thinking of it as anything different than saying I went to the Berkshires or I went to the Poconos. I really should have just said I went to the countryside somewhere, and I'm not going to tell you where. So because of the particular location that I had named, it drew a bunch of people who were basically social justice advocates in the realm of Appalachia. And anything that somebody like me would say about that region would be interpreted as a punch down. And so that, I'm not going to say that if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have gotten a lot of blowback, but I think that accounts for a lot of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so what do you think of the criticisms of your piece? What do you think was valid and what do you think was not valid?
A lot of things were criticized about the piece. One was that I was being glib as a New Yorker coming to Appalachia. And, I had some sort of funny kind of light-handed moments in the piece that were totally misinterpreted. I said something at one point like, I'm totally panicked and I'm losing my mind and I can't remember, the last thing I thought about before I left. And I said something like, this is no way to live. And some people interpreted that as my saying that living in this part of the world is no way to live, which is so preposterous. I would never think that. In fact, this is a way better way to live than a lot of other places, now and always. So there were some sort of tone issues that I guess if I had been more aware of the larger context with the baggage around this region, I would have been a little more careful with my tone. But a lot of the problem was that people were just shaming me for being a virus spreader. So, now the idea is that if you dare to leave New York and go anywhere else, you are absolutely on the wrong side of this lockdown of history of everything. and that you should not do this. So I should have, I guess, been a little more clear about the precautions I took. The reason that I chose to come to this particular place, and I'm not going to tell you where it is, but I made sure that it was within an hour's drive or so of 3 pretty big cities with medical facilities that are not like rural hospitals, like cities that would have more than one hospital, large hospital, that kind of thing. Like, I didn't want to really get into like the nitty gritty details in the piece because it just sounds defensive and it's also irrelevant. But I think the fact that those were not included gave people an in to then obsess about how irresponsible I had been.
The immediate impulse is just to assume the worst on Twitter and sort of everywhere, and then perform it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I should confess, I left New York a while ago. I was very lucky. I had a place I could come to stay in Massachusetts, and I think it is morally complicated. And I think it's just bothered me the way people make certain very strong assumptions about a situation that is complicated. I mean, I'm not necessarily sure it would be better. I'm torn about it, but would it be better to stay in New York and to further tax a severely overtaxed health system? Or is it better to leave and risk spreading it a little bit? It just seems like there are all these variables that people sort of ignore. And even that detail you just provided about being within an hour of 3 major cities, like, to me, that really tilts the balance pretty significantly.
Right. It's like the mandatory privilege disclaimer, which every personal essay has to have right now, where like you have to throw this in just to like make keep the wolves like from attacking you for some reason.
Right. And that's another thing that I did not do. I said to myself, okay, write the piece and don't waste, don't spend a lot of time clearing your throat about how lucky it is that you are able to do this and how, most people don't have this opportunity and you're going to make up for it in some other way in the future. I mean, do we? I really am on a sort of mission, just as a writer, to stop doing the check, because if we all stop doing it, maybe it won't be necessary anymore.
I'm glad you are on that mission. I'm also on that mission, and it has absolutely come back to haunt me. But it's like, you don't have to spell it out in every fucking piece. Like, everybody is aware that there are levels of privilege in the world that are based on class and race and everything else. And it's like just put up an asterisk, this like, and then at the bottom there can be a footnote that says privilege disclaimer here. It's just like, we have to do this so Twitter doesn't get mad at us. It's not good writing. Jesse, I'm curious about your sort of perspective on this. Have you encountered this sort of animosity where you are against New Yorkers coming to quarantine?
Yeah. And I frankly, I think it's justified because there's a lot going on here. There is a class thing. Like, it is, you don't need to do the whole privilege disclaimer to say that you're lucky if you have an option of another place you can go. And the sort of job that I have where I can just do it from anywhere. There's definitely, like, in a lot of communities on, like, to take the Northeast examples, like Long Island and Cape Cod, like, a lot of people who live in those places year round don't want the virus to come to them, which is understandable. I just also think that I know a lot of people who left New York because they were lucky enough to be able to go somewhere else. And I just think it's sort of tricky in the moment to say, well, I'm just going to ride it out here, even if things are falling apart, even if I'm worried. This isn't my situation, but like worried about my own healthcare access. I just think it's complicated at the end of the day, and I wouldn't really begrudge anyone their specific choices. But there's definitely hostility, and I think it's justified, especially in places that are sort of quiet 3/4 of the year and then fill up with summer tourists who are usually just there because it's like nice and pretty in the summer, and now we're using it as sort of an escape hatch.
Right, totally. That's been a lot of the conversation about this happening out here in Washington State, is these communities that rely on tourism in the summer now all of a sudden saying, like, we don't want you here, and the tourists are saying, we're the people who keep your community basically afloat by spending our money for 3 months of the year, and now you're kicking us out. And so there's this like real tension here between sort of the rural urban divide, which is very complex, very nuanced. And what I like about these essays is that, it goes in, all of these essays that I read sort of go into this a little bit. And what everybody eventually comes down on the side of saying is like, I'm going to do what's right for me. The people who are in rural areas would do the same thing. This is what people do. Like, you're in a disaster. I think I would be shocked to find too many people who really had the opportunity to leave New York or wherever and didn't take it.
Right.
Absolutely. We should just keep in mind how bad faith this stuff is. And a lot of the people who are mad at Meghan, if it hadn't been Meghan who had written the piece, but someone who had politics they weren't furious at, I'm not convinced they would have been as angry about it.
I was interested in noticing that Masha Gessen doesn't seem to have been dragged as much for the piece she wrote in the New Yorker.
Right.
So, I mean, maybe I missed something there, but yeah.
I liked Masha's piece. There was one quote that I did find sort of infuriating. She interviewed some guy who's like a professional human rights guy, and he went to some small town in Massachusetts or somewhere like that, and he said, we're being really careful. We only go to the grocery store every 3 or 4 days. And to me, it's like, you're like, that is fucking tone deaf, dude. Okay, come on. Like, get more shit on one trip, You should at least, like, if you're going to these areas, you should at least, like, really make an effort to quarantine yourself.
Yeah. It's like how the question again is like, how specific do you have to be? Like, are you really not allowed to write about anything in this territory if you're not going to be completely clear? Go down the checklist, reassure everyone of what you did. I didn't say in the piece, I did sort of try to clarify on Twitter for what it's worth. Like, I didn't leave my apartment for 14 days before I came down. I stayed on the farm for 14 days after I got here. But then, people are like, well, did you stop for gas on the way down? And what about that? And what if it's really 21 days? And you can drive yourself crazy with this stuff. And, another thing too, and this really speaks to sort of the nature of publishing and the way stories get framed and the way, Twitter headlines are constructed. Like, I never thought of this piece as a leaving New York piece. I thought of it as like a staring into space, chasing a puppy around piece. And because of the headline and because then the story kind of got packaged with another piece by Glynis McNichol, a beautiful piece about staying in New York, really spectacular essay. It kind of got teed up as like, oh, well, this is about leaving New York. And to me, it was really about something much more just sort of existential. Like, it was about not being able to get a handle on your experience, not, having to deal with a situation that's on such a big canvas that there's no way yet to step back far enough to see what it really is. And that's why I wrote the piece, even though I knew what would happen. I wanted to get at those ideas. I was just really itching to try to delve into them. And, maybe I could have done a better job in some ways, but, at the end of the day, I really, like I said, I think I would have just been so ashamed of myself for not doing the story I wanted to do because of the Twitter response. And I wish, I always say this when I teach, you cannot let that stop you. It's not even a matter of being brave. It's a matter of doing your job. Like, our job as writers is to say what we think and what we observe and what the truth is, regardless of what others are saying. And that seems very simple, but it's become incredibly difficult.
Right. It's like, would it be better if you pretended to be in your New York apartment? I mean, like, people are asking you to basically lie, to shut the fuck up, to not write about your experience, which I think is totally insane.
Right. Well, I mean, that's the thing is, and, there was a Huffington Post piece by Claire Fallon, which was actually very cleverly written. I thought it was very entertaining.
Yeah, we talked about it.
Really slamming those pieces, slamming my piece and Masha's piece and a couple of other ones. And, her ultimate conclusion is, well, you can do this shameful thing, but maybe you should do us all the favor of just not admitting it.
Right.
Keeping it to yourself. And I thought, wow, that's really where we are. Like, the crime is not leaving the city. It's admitting that you left the city.
Right.
And
totally.
that in and of itself is like a fascinating sort of phenomenon that as a writer, like, I want to dig into.
Right. I've been experiencing something sort of similar. I'll make a confession to you guys. So, my wife and I got married a couple weeks ago. And so we wanted to, like, do something to, like, mark this. So we decided to take a 1-day honeymoon. And our honeymoon, we decided we were just going to drive around the Olympic Peninsula, not stop for gas, not stop for groceries, literally not encounter any other human beings, just, like, stop and look at the beach and then just go on, like, an 8-hour drive. And we did it, and it was great. And I haven't been telling anybody about it. I've been sort of ashamed that we like left our house. I mean, we literally didn't encounter another fucking human being. We didn't touch any surfaces outside of our car.
We went for a drive, Katie. That's so
we went
like
for a drive.
1950s. That's like something that John Draper and his family would do.
Yeah, we went for a Sunday drive, and I've been feeling like, oh my God, what if somebody finds out? Meghan, thank you so much for popping into our show. It's good to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks, Meghan.
Thanks for having me, and congratulations on the podcast. It's great.
Oh, thank you. All right, enjoy your quarantine.
You too. Stay safe.
Okay, thank you to Meghan Daum for coming on our show, and thank you to everyone who freaked out about her piece so we would have something to talk about.
Yeah, like I still think it was wrong of her to create this virus and unleash it on the world, but I think hearing her side of the story definitely made my views more nuanced.
I mean, she should not have done it in bear habitat.
No.
Sure.
Okay, well, I mean, that's mostly it for the show. As always, we're at blockedandreportedpodcast@gmail.com. Please continue to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. We're also on Twitter at @TheBarPod. Any other sort of housekeeping notes, Katie, or is that it, do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty much it for this week.
This has been Blocked and Reported. I'm Jesse Single, and remember, if you're not paying all your friends for sex every single day, you are part of the problem.
And I'm Katie Herzog. And also remember, it's fine to leave New York in a pandemic, but if you do it, don't tell anyone.